From Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. I'm Shelby Varner. K-State Rangeland Management Specialist Walt Fick starts the show by talking about Sericea Lespedeza and the issues it creates and how to possibly control it. Keeping the show rolling is K-State Extension beef veterinarian A.J. Tarpoff as he explains heat stress in cattle. He talks about how to mitigate it and resources available to help do so. For many gardeners, food preservation is an important part of the growing and harvesting process. To end today's show, K-State food scientist Karen Blakeslee offers tips for safely canning and preserving homegrown foods. That and more is coming up ahead on Agriculture Today. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we start our Thursday show talking about Sericea Lespedeza with K-State Rangeland Management Specialist Walt Fick. Walt, thanks for joining us today.
Good to be with you, Shelby.
Walt, what is Sericea Lespedeza?
Well, Sericea Lespedeza is a legume. People, that's a type of plant such as alfalfa and other legumes that we have. It was introduced a number of years ago, I think here in Kansas, probably pretty much during the 30s, probably dates back to about that point in time, but really wasn't noticed till much of a problem till, about in the 80s, 1980s. But it is a perennial that grows to big conditions. Our tallest conditions I've seen maybe 6 or 7 feet tall out of southeast Kansas, but most time it's maybe waist high in a lot of the state. Those are kind of the basic facts about Sericea. It is to identify it. It's being a legume, it has 3 leaflets, kind of like a clover, except those leaflets are club-shaped. They're broader toward the tip of that leaflet than they are in the middle or the base, and we can use that to distinguish it from some other related Lespedezas that we do have in the state.
You mentioned it being a problem, and what problem can it create?
Well, it's a problem in terms of grazing for most of our, particularly for cattle. The problem is it contains a condensed tannin that ties up the protein, making it indigestible, at least to cattle. Now, however, sheep and goats will graze Sericea fairly well. But if, this is primarily a beef state. We got, 6 million head of beef cattle in the state. And so they may graze it early, but everything's good quality early, so they don't seem to graze it too much then. And so if it's not getting grazing pressure, at least by cattle, then it tends to increase, invade over time. And we know if we don't do something with it, it'll eventually take over.
And is this considered a noxious weed?
It is a noxious weed in Kansas, has been since, I believe it was July 1 of 2000, so it's been quite a while since it's become a statewide noxious weed.
Walt, what is the life cycle of Sericea Lespedeza?
Well, as I said, Sericea Lespedeza is a perennial, so it comes back each year. It'll germinate start growth in the spring, probably even late April, early May. Now this year it might have been early; things are earlier this year, but it'll come above ground and remains in a vegetative stage. By midsummer, it might be that 2 to 3 feet tall. Actually starts to branch at that point in time. As day lengths get shorter, so after, sometime in late July, early August, then the plant will maybe start to bloom, produce flowers, although that's generally August and September is the primary time of the year it flowers. So it has kind of I'd call like a pea-like flower on it, and pretty much a cream to white flower with a purple throat on it. And we can use that. That helps us also distinguish it from some of our native Lespedezas.
Where might people find Sericea Lespedeza?
Well, Sericea is pretty widespread in the state. I know if you, at any given point in time, the noxious weed departments do surveys, and it usually is going to occur in probably at least 60 to 70 of the counties in Kansas. Mostly, in eastern and central Kansas will be a widespread area. It is primarily, I think, on rangeland and pasture. You may see it, though, on roadsides. But, since it's a noxious weed, I think, departments of transportation and groups that managing roadsides are probably looking for it and probably spray or at least mow it back to keep it from going to seed. But range and pasture primarily.
How might someone want to control or manage this?
Well, there are a number of options, and of course this is from the Flint Hills area, at least here in eastern Kansas, where we burn pretty regularly, so we've looked at using prescribed burning. However, burning in the spring, at the end of the dormant season, sometimes it's not even above ground yet, so you're not going to do much damage. If you can delay burning later, get a little, 5 or 6 inches of growth on Sericea with a spring burn, you might set it back temporarily, but it's not going to kill it. But fire, we found that burning in let's say August, kind of like mid-August, so a growing season burn has been shown to at least eliminate seed production on the plant. You may reduce its stature, probably not going to reduce overall population very much unless you're able to do that year after year. But that's a pretty unusual situation to be able to do that, on an annual basis. But so we've looked at fire. Mowing, you can repeatedly mow it. Well, single mowing, I've looked at that and kind of, let's say, mid to late July when we typically would hay our native hay meadows in a single mowing. After doing that, it was like 4 or 5 years. Then I started to reduce the stand, but it didn't completely eliminate it. Repeated mowing, though, would probably take it out. The problem with that is if it's out on range and pasture, we don't want to repeatedly mow off the pasture, though, either. So that doesn't become too much of a use or a way to control it. Although we could use both fire and mowing in conjunction, following that up with a herbicide, and that can be effective. So kind of use an integrated approach with different methods, and that can be fairly effective. Probably, though, herbicides are probably the primary way at this point in time people are still trying to manage and control Sericea Lespedeza.
What are those herbicide options that people might want to consider?
It varies a little bit with time of the year. Here we're in the springtime of the year, early summer. The plant's vegetative. Once it gets 10 or 12 inches tall, that's the time I would consider treating it, starting to treat it. Herbicides that contain, I'll use chemical names, I'll give you some trade names, triclopyr and fluroxypyr. Those herbicides work quite well here in the early summer on vegetative growth stages. So products like Remedy Ultra contains the triclopyr, so 1 to 2 pints per acre of that product seems to work pretty well. Fluroxypyr then is one of the chemicals that's in a product called Pasture Guard HL. It actually contains both triclopyr and fluroxypyr. So this time of the year, those are probably the 2 primary products that are being used. I would mention another one that contains fluroxypyr, though, is called Surmount. It contains picloram, which like in Tordon, so it's a restricted use compound, but it contains picloram and the fluroxypyr. And that one also works quite well on Sericea Lespedeza. And if you happen to be, if you had rough leaf dogwood in a pasture right now, it's out there blooming, and you're treating Sericea, that product, Pasture Guard, also works on the dogwood. Later in the year, then we kind of switch over and use products that contain metsulfuron, which the primary one of those would be Escort XP.
So right now, a great time to treat for Sericea Lespedeza, but also possibly other weeds that people are seeing out in their pasture?
Well, some of these certain herbicides then will provide control of some other broadleaf species. Some are better than others, but Remedy and Pasture Guard they're primarily, frankly, brush killers, but they do work on Sericea Lespedeza and some of the other broadleafs.
If people are out there taking care of it right now, is this something that they're probably going to have to take care of for the next few years?
One of the problems with Sericea, and probably the biggest problem we have, is once it gets established and has gone to seed, that seed remains viable in the soil for decades, probably 20 years or longer. So it's not a one-shot thing. You're going to take care of it. You may set it back for a year or two, and then either the crowns of those plants that you did not effectively kill off and or seed then germinates and it keeps coming back. So people have been fighting it for years. Many of them just gotten in the habit every maybe 2 to 4 years they've just planned to spray.
That was Kansas State University Rangeland Management Specialist Walt Fick. If you'd like to read more about Sericea Lespedeza, you can do so from the May 16th Agronomy e-update. The article in that e-update is titled Early Summer Control of Sericea Lespedeza Using Herbicides. You can find it by going to the link in today's show notes on agtoday.net, or you can find it for yourself by going to eupdate.agronomy.ksu.edu. Again, that is eupdate.agronomy.ksu.edu. Before we cut to a break, we're now going to be joined by USDA's Gary Crawford and USDA meteorologist Brad Rippey as he talks about how producers are keeping up the pace of planting despite storms.
In spite of a lot of stormy weather across the country,
producers are managing to keep up with 5-year average numbers on planting, and warm weather in behind that planting is keeping emergence and development pretty much ahead of schedule.
USDA meteorologist Brad Rippey says this past week we saw what he calls respectable numbers for corn and soybeans. Looking at corn, 89% of the crop is planted.
That is 1 point ahead of the 5-year average.
Corn emergence dead on the 5-year average of 58%. And as for the planting number for beans,
the national number on May 26th, 68% planted, 5 points ahead of the 5-year average of 63%.
And the soybean emergence number?
39% emerged on May 26th, 5-year average 36%.
So as Brad said earlier,
in spite of almost daily thunderstorms in some areas,
producers still making good progress getting beans and corn planted and established. Gary Crawford for the U.S. Department of Agriculture.
Once again, that was USDA's Gary Crawford and USDA meteorologist Brad Rippey. If you'd like to keep up to date with the weather that's taking place in Kansas, you can do so by going to the Mesonet website. You can find that by going to Mesonet.ksu.edu. We're getting to a short break now on Agriculture Today, but stick around because we have more for you ahead.
You're tuned back into Agriculture Today. We continue our show by discussing heat stress with K-State Beef Extension veterinarian AJ Tarpoff. AJ, thank you for joining us.
Always a pleasure to be here.
AJ, what is heat stress and what causes it within beef cattle?
Yeah, so heat stress is really the mechanisms that cattle try to adapt to a warmer temperature. You and I, whenever we get hot, we sweat. Right? And that's a way of to be able to pull some of that heat away. The sweat evaporates and it pulls that heat off the body. So we're trying to maintain homeostasis. Well, for our livestock species, and especially cattle, they don't have the sweat producing capabilities. So what they do is they try to dissipate heat in other ways by, one, getting into more comfortable areas. Two, they actually increase their respiratory rate or their breathing. So they use their lungs, believe it or not, to be able to dissipate some of that heat. So what we'll see is animals start to pant. Okay, so if you can picture a dog panting, those are things that we might see as the body temperature starts to increase in cattle. That we'll start seeing some of those symptoms like heavier breathing or even open mouth breathing.
AJ, what specific temperatures and weather conditions make cattle the most prone to heat stress?
So when we think about heat stress or cold stress, any environmental stressor, there's 4 key parameters that we really think about with heat stress. And, obviously temperature and humidity. Everybody, when you wake up in the morning, check the news, you hear the forecast, and you'll get temperature. Okay, well, temperature is only one piece of the pie. For how our animals really feel the environment around them, it's temperature, humidity, which we think about the humidity index, right? Sometimes we'll have some of those index scores that you'll hear on the radio or hear on the news. But with cattle, we take it a step further. The other 2 parameters that are missing in that heat index are wind speed and solar radiation. Okay, those 4 parameters really make up on the real feel for, if we really start thinking along the lines of how cattle feel the environment, because they're very different from us. Where we're comfortable, cattle, they might be uncomfortable, and vice versa. So when we really need to take into those 4 key parameters. And what's interesting is we actually have that in a model called an Animal Comfort Index, and that's available on the Kansas Mesonet website. So it uses those 4 parameters to give a real feel on how cattle are experiencing the environment in local areas around the state of Kansas.
Why should people be concerned about heat stress?
why we care, why we manage, why we, really worry about this is it's the day in and day out. It is one of those critical chores, just as important as feeding or making sure the animals have water. Providing animal comfort is really an investment in our animals, whether we're asking them to be reproductive cows, out in the pasture, whether we're asking that animal to produce beef in a feedlot, whatever we're asking that animal to do, when we invest in animal comfort, when scenarios get uncomfortable, when we invest in them, make them more comfortable, they are more productive, they're more profitable, and they really sustain, and we kind of build that suspension under those animals where they can handle more of some of the environmental constraints that are around them.
You mentioned before panting. Are there any other physical signs of heat stress that you can find in cattle?
Yeah, so some of the other physical signs, yes, we'll see increased breathing rates. One interesting piece is cattle, they don't lay down as much, especially whenever they get heat stress. They're trying to increase airflow. Unfortunately, that might lead to bunching, where groups of cattle, even in a pasture, will bunch up together. They're trying to get increased airflow, but they end up using each other as shade, which is kind of counterproductive. So we need to keep a close eye for that. Now, when given access, cattle may crowd around water tanks, right? Go down into ponds if they're out in a pasture. Unfortunately, that can lead to some problems where they don't have enough access to water, especially for a water tank. We'll always see the one animal standing in the water tank when the rest of them are trying to drink. So we have grouping, we have bunching, we have water-seeking and shade-seeking behaviors, and a lot increased standing. Okay, so those are all kind of different things that we can see when animals start to heat up or to experience some of those heat stress.
For cattle being housed in dry lots, what can be done to limit the effects of heat stress?
Yeah, that's always that's a great question. I just want to make sure everybody understands heat stress is not a new phenomenon. We have been dealing with managing heat stress for as long as we've had domesticated cattle. Okay, so this isn't anything new, but how we house them, where we house them, may change some of our management strategies when things get hot, as those temperature and humidities rise and maybe that wind starts to die down. We need to think about back to the basics. So whenever it comes to heat stress, it's back to the basics. Feed and water. Okay, water, when we're in a dry lot condition, just to put this into perspective, the water intake can nearly double as the temperature rises from 70 degrees to 90 degrees. So we can start thinking we need more access, we need more flow. Water availability for those animals is absolutely critical when the temperatures start to rise. A good reminder right now, especially if you have automatic water tanks, many times we have a winter level and a summer level. And the winter level, obviously, to keep it from freezing is a little bit less flow, lower volume. We want to make sure those are bumped up to the summer levels to have maximum capacity. Increasing water tank capacity. Either we can split pens and increase water tank capacity that way, or even put some portable tubs into those pens to increase the water availability whenever those animals need it. So that's number one. Number two is feeding. Okay, some of our feeding, we might be able to modify our feeding times to be able to help alleviate some of these stressors. Whenever we feed cattle, we feed the rumen microbes in the rumen, and there's a cost to that. Yes, they can digest things that you and I cannot, but that comes at a cost of what we call the heat of fermentation. So as they digest those feedstuffs, they actually increase the amount of heat that they produce. So what we can try to do is we can change our feeding times or even adapt some of our feeding management. We can feed later in the evening, so that way the heat of digestion that happens 4 to 6 hours after they eat happens in the cooler nighttime hours. So feed and water, number one. Other than that, let's think about the pen floor itself. Okay, a pen floor can reach up to 140 degrees during the heat of the day. That's that solar radiation that really beats down and gets absorbed into that dirt floor. One thing that we can do is we can actually put out straw. We think about bedding for cold winter months. Bedding's also a phenomenal tool during heat stress events that we can plan ahead, get that bedding put into those pens, and we can reduce the pen floor temperature by up to 25 degrees just by putting out that bedding. That's one way. The other pieces are really more infrastructure based. and that would be shades and sprinklers. Sprinkler systems, we typically use sprinkler systems for more dust mitigation in our commercial feedlots. They can also be used to help cool the pen floors. We don't necessarily attribute those sprinklers to truly cooling the animals themselves, because that's difficult to accomplish in outdoor scenarios. We would actually have to soak the animal completely. But what our goal is to use those sprinklers in the nighttime cooling hours to be able to get a little moisture on that pen floor, to be able to allow that to evaporate so we can cool the pen floor in the overnight hours. And then shade. Obviously, shade's an investment. It's a piece of infrastructure. Recently finished a 2-year trial here at K-State at our beef stocker unit, showing some of the added benefits of investing into shade, and where we did see increased efficiency, increased growth rate and average daily gain, reduced panning rates, and also reduced water needs. That was kind of a neat attribute of that study, as we found that just shade by itself reduces water needs of those growing animals by over a gallon per head per day.
Can producers manage heat stress in cattle that are out on grass?
They can. So it's obviously animals out in the pasture, they have options. Okay, they can find the wind currents and some of the hills on the pastures. They can seek out some of the shaded areas. They can go stand in a pond if need be. So typically our animals out in the pasture, they don't have the same type of heat issues that we do in confinement. Remember I mentioned the pen floor can get to that type of temperature. Out in a pasture, they have more access to different currents, different breezes, and the dirt and the grass does not reach that elevated temperature that it would on a dirt lot. So again, we just try to provide added support for those animals. Shade occasionally, if there's not shaded areas or draws with trees and things like that in it, they will seek out shade. I've even seen cattle line up behind a telephone pole just from the shade of a telephone pole. So sometimes providing some of that shade and some of that benefit, as long as we do give enough space for those animals so they don't bunch up. That would be the biggest thing with some of our pasture animals, but really water. Making sure they have clean access, ready access to water. They can sustain and they can adapt and they can do very well out in those pasture settings with pretty minimal maintenance from us.
Lastly, where should beef producers go to find more information about heat stress?
Yeah, more information. The KLA, Kansas Livestock Association, has a heat stress page on their website. You can go to ksubeef.org, which is our beef extension website, that we have some information available. Kansas Mesonet website, okay, Mesonet.ksu.edu. So all of these tools that are available out there, there's information. You can find those tools, use them, plan accordingly, plan ahead, contact your veterinarian, contact folks that if you have questions on how to be more prepared in some of these scenarios, don't be afraid to reach out.
Thank you for joining us, AJ.
Thank you.
That was K-State Beef Extension veterinarian A.J. Tarpoff on heat stress in beef cattle. I'm Jacob Cloughton for Shelby Varner, and we're taking a short break now, but we'll be back with more up ahead.
This is Agriculture Today. Along with Shelby Varner, I'm Jeff Wickman. For many, food preservation is an important part of home gardening. Karen Blakeslee, a food scientist at Kansas State University, offers tips for the upcoming canning season. She says that if you're planning to do any canning this season, making sure that everything is ready to go before harvest begins can save a lot of stress and time.
In particular, if you're planning to pressure can anything and you have a dial gauge type canner, bring that gauge to your local extension office. They have testing equipment to test your gauge. Now, there's only 4 brands that we can test, and that includes National, Presto, Maid of Honor, and Magic Seal. All of those brands are supported by the Presto company. I do know that the All-American canners have a dial gauge on them. We cannot test those. So give your local extension office a call about getting your gauge tested so that you know how accurate or inaccurate it is. That's really important for safety of the foods that you're going to pressure can. Make sure your jars are clean, they're not damaged. Run your finger around the top rim of the jars. Make sure there's not any nicks or cracks in the jars. Look over the entire jar itself. Because jars can be reused many times. Just take good care of them. Really, the only thing you need to buy new every year is lids, because they can only be used once, the metal flat lids. There's plenty of supplies out there now. The days of the shortages have passed us. Now, one thing that I did this year is I updated all of our publications. So we have publications on different food groups, vegetables in general, and then we also have beans, tomatoes, cucumbers, apples, peaches, corn. Those are probably the most common things that Kansans like to preserve. We've had these out for years, and we've just updated them over the years. I've switched out some recipes in there to give you some ideas on how to use these different food products. So take a look at them, and hopefully they will give you some good guidance on how to preserve your food safely. We also have how-to guides on water bath canning, which includes steam canning, and then also a how-to guide on pressure canning, because the steps in doing each of those processes is basically the same no matter what kind of canner, what brand of canner you're using. But always read your manuals for your particular canner to make sure you understand how your canner is supposed to work. We also have some information on salsa in particular, because everybody likes to make salsa, and I love salsa myself. So there's that, and also I'm making jerky, meat jerky, and then we also have a publication, just some good information on remembering to adjust your processing for your elevation. Kansas is not as flat as everybody thinks, because when you go up in elevation, the boiling point of water goes down. So you have to accommodate for that. So take a look at those. They're also in Spanish. They're free. The download off of the K-State Extension bookstore or off of my website, the Rapid Response Center.
And the science-based aspect of it is what really makes our information much more reliable.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, food preservation is all based on science. There are a lot of parameters that have to be measured to safely preserve food inside of the jar. But also with dehydrating and freezing, there's a lot of science that goes into that. You know, in talking about freezing in general, freezing doesn't improve foods, but there are some steps you should take to make sure the quality stays the best it can during the freezing process and then after when you're ready to use it. And the same thing with dehydration. On both of those, protecting the color of fruits such as peaches and apples, make sure they don't go brown on you. There's ways to prevent that from happening, simply using lemon juice or some ascorbic acid mixtures. It's so easy to take that step and make sure that color doesn't change. And then in vegetables in particular, for both dehydrating and freezing, blanching, whether it's water blanching or steam blanching, that's important to preserve the color, the texture, the flavor during the freezing or the dehydrating process so that you get the best quality in the end when you're ready to use it.
That's Kansas State University food scientist Karen Blakeslee with information on preparing for the upcoming canning season. To find out if food preservation classes are being offered near you, contact the local extension office. And that'll do it for this edition of Agriculture Today. For Shelby Varner, I'm Jeff Wickman. This is the K-State Radio Network.